The Arab Spring. Its events have dominated international news for over a year, sending 17 Middle Eastern countries into riots, protests, and even the overthrowing of governments. With a total death toll numbering almost 40,000 and steadily growing, it all started with a Tunisian Burning Man. This led to the riots of Cairo Square, all of massive police brutality in other nations, and the bombing of Gaddafi forces by NATO military. It was the end of several well-known Middle Eastern governments and the start of the Arab Revolution. Tunisia, the country that started it all. Initial riots were sparked by the suicide of Mohamed Bouazizi, a street merchant who set himself on fire due to government treatment on December 10, 2010. His death started many riots, protesting unemployment and government corruption around the country. The economy was in a state of decline, as a transferring of the tax burden from the wealthy to the poor was occurring. The people wanted a change in their government, as President Ben Ali had ruled Tunisia since 1987, and had done so with an iron fist. On January 3, 2011, protesters attacked the Constitutional Democratic Rally Office after police fired tear gas into a mosque. Riots continued until January 14th, when President Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia. The Prime Minister, Ghannouchi, then came to power and attempted to rearrange the government, but after protests continued, he resigned shortly after. The government is now currently a 217-member assembly, led by President Marzouki. Egypt, like Tunisia, has had a long-standing government. Hosni Mubarak first started ruling following the assassination of President Anwar el-Sadat in 1981. In the years since then, the country's been in a continuous state of emergency. The first Egyptian protests started in January 25, 2010, inspired by the current revolution that was happening in Tunisia. Then, in 2010, a parliamentary election took place in which a large media crackdown resulted in 5,000 to 10,000 people in long detention without trial. Police brutality was high, with 567 cases of torture and 167 deaths. A corrupt election won Mubarak office again, with only 25% voter turnout. To try and contain news of this, the government did away with freedom of the press and used torture to deter bloggers. Then, on January 26, the government took the next step and shut down the internet. But after mounting international pressure due to police brutality, Mubarak gave his power to the vice president, but said he would remain in office till the end of his term. But after massive protests such as the Million Man March in Cairo Square, he resigned and gave his power to the military, under the command of Mohammed Hussein, who continues to rule to this day.
The Libyan Civil War, so far the bloodiest conflict that has occurred in the Arab Spring. Since 1969, Gaddafi has held control with the manipulation of the People's Congress and the People's Committee, the only supposed elected parts of their government. Under his rule, the literacy rate rose from 10 to 90%, and life expectancy rose 20 years. On the other hand, 16% of families had no members working, and 43% only had one member working. Medicine was very selective, and most people went to neighboring countries for medicine and doctors. Many protests began because of bad living conditions, a 20% unemployment rate, and, for most of all, the need for democracy and civil rights. Economic mobility was almost unseen due to the control of business by government. Libya also led Africa in the worst human rights and treatment, with large amounts of police brutality and live coverage of hangings of people. Massive protesting started on February 17th, known as the Day of Rage, where 7 cities went into mass protests and started destroying government buildings. On February 18th, part of the police force and army joined these protests. After this, Gaddafi said that protesters were using hallucinogenic drugs from Al-Qaeda and that he'd cleanse house by house himself. This is when the use of snipers, artillery, and gunships started, and the battles with the rebels took place. During the battles between pro and anti-Gaddafi forces, Gaddafi sent raiding parties into hospitals, disposing of all the dead and killing all wounded rebels. Later that month, the use of death squads and mercenaries was permitted to terrorize the population. Even with Gaddafi's attempts to censor the Western media, various factors influenced NATO countries along with the US to get involved. The bombardment of Libya began in late June, which helped rebel troops sweep through the country, to eventually kill Gaddafi on October 20th and later find his son's compound. The final liberation of Libya was finally pronounced on October 23rd and has since formed an interim government led by El-Kiep. US and NATO involvement started even before the Arab Spring had begun, with Egypt being one of America's greatest allies in the Middle East, along with Tunisia having close ties to the French and US government, with both of these nations refusing to denounce its former ruler Ben Ali. Many revolutions like Egypt's have had the backing of the US, Great Britain, and France, along with billions of dollars of their aid. Major NATO involvement started March 19th with the firing of 110 Tomahawk missiles at Gaddafi forces, along with the bombing of a military base by B-2 stealth bombers. Nations involved in these acts have been criticized for wasteful spending, corrupt motives, and not aiding other countries such as Syria. The killing of an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 civilians has also brought much criticism from the Muslim Brotherhood. This operation ended on October 31st with the killing of Gaddafi. The total cost of this mission to the US was $1.1 billion, and all the nations combined was $2.8 billion. NATO, and especially the US, continue to supply aid to these Middle Eastern countries.
But is it over? Will the Arab Spring yet add another season to its title? Or will it become another page entombed in history? The rising up of a few nations has given courage to others to follow their lead. The uprisings in Syria has yet to see an end. With the recent crackdown on protesters by the government and the formation of the Free Syrian Army, the death toll has risen to over 8,000. President al-Bashar has turned a deaf ear to the pleas of his people, and civil war has become a viable option for the future of the country. Even though Egypt has ousted their ruler, they are still unhappy with the current leaders. Under military rule, the postponing of elections has become common. With people wanting a democratic form of government, there are many who fear that the elections would be corrupted. But with the success of people establishing new governments, will the new leaders rule as to benefit the country or themselves, and yet again descend into tyranny?